Good evening, everybody. All right, I wanna read some Heraclitus and see if we can kind of get to and think through the logos in the deepest sense of the word. And I'm reading this from Ivo de Janeiro, Principles of Philosophy. This is his translation of what is this Fragment 50. You know, apparently I've been reading a bunch of different interpretations or translations, and there's so many different ways that things are translated. But what I'm liking about this translation is he, and as far as I can tell, is taking the translation back to the original ancient Greek understanding of being, right? So I think you take great pain to not bring in like Cartesianist thinking and different thinkings that and presuppositions that were laid out after Heraclitus. So his translations just seem mind-blowing to me, actually. Okay, so this one, it reads, provided you listen not to me, but gather yourself into the gathering itself. An accordance in gathering gives rise to the fitting knowledge, all atones one. I'll read that again. Provided you listen not to me, but gather yourself into the gathering itself, in accordance in gathering gives rise to the fitting knowledge, one atones all. So I'll read that one more time. Provided you listen not to me, but gather yourself into the gathering itself, in accordance in gathering gives rise to the fitting knowledge, one atones all. Gives a shorter interpretation here too, a shorter translation. Listening not to me, but owning to the gathering, agreement on the same, fair knowledge breaks one all. So this one atones all. You know, it's interesting because I think first reading, you know, you can kind of hear that as you can probably at a less fitted hearing would be to hear that the logos is simply hearing the one, as if the logos is like in the one. And to listen to the logos is to listen to that all things are one. However, if you think about it, if that were the case, there would be the first part of the fragment wouldn't need to exist, right? So it's like provided you listen not to me, right? So that's the first hint in hearing it. But gather yourself, and I think in this sense, the gather yourself being, you could imagine like the soul or the psyche, right? Your self-gathering into the gathering itself, or the logos. So the psyche gathering itself into the gathering itself of logos. So psyche, logos, there's that relationship. In accordance in gathering, this accord, right, this relationship, psyche and logos, in gathering gives rise to the fitting knowledge, right? So the fitting knowledge, this accord, the soul or the psyche gathers into the gathering as such, i.e. the logos, in accordance in gathering, gives rise to the fitting knowledge. One atones all. Right? So all of that, before all that, before one atones all, if the one was simply there and the logos was in the one, right? You wouldn't need to have a psyche and a gathering and an accordance and a fitted knowledge, and you wouldn't have to make sure that you weren't listening to Heraclitus, but listening to the logos. No, there's something at stake in our listening to the logos, which affords something like the one atoning all. So what I take this to mean is really interesting when you think about this, because it shows that the logos is heard through our participation with the logos, right? And our participation with the logos, you could say the little L logos, right, relates to the big L logos. And first of all, it presupposes that it doesn't have to be this way. So in other words, I could actually end up just hearing you, right, the speaker. If I just hear the speaker, I'm not going to hear the logos. He's making a distinction there. So I think the distinction is the one between hearing and listening, right? What is it to hear? What is to listen? And I think hearing connotates more of a surface sense, like I can hear the background music, or I can hear the ambient noise, right? There's a sense in which I don't have to look into or listen into what I'm hearing, right? I can just hear it and it be given, and that's satisfactory enough, right? But to listen, right, is something else. Listening seems to presuppose that I'm not just hearing the words. I'm not just hearing Heraclitus, right, as what we're doing right now, I imagine, is a kind of listening. Like we're listening to the logos, which means I'm listening to what isn't immediately apparent, right? So I look at appearance and I comport myself in such a way. I bring my psyche, right, my constitutional openness to the logos, to the world, and I comport it in a listening way, such that my gathering is gathered into the deeper logos, the deeper intelligibility that's gathering the particulars of the appearance or the words that are being spoken. And it's in that surrendering, it's in that deeper listening that I get this sense that something catches, right? My logos, I listen with my logos, right? And in listening with the logos, the psyche, something catches, and it, like my gathering becomes gathered by the deeper dynamic of intelligibility. And then through that, right, a fitting knowledge, right? And I think the fittingness speaks to this, this given potentiality of being, right? This possibility of psyche, right? This possibility of being a human being, right? Which is an authentic one, to be authentically human, to become human, right? In the aspirational sense, right? The telos of human, to unfold with one's whole being, to listen with one's whole being to the world in such a way that the gathering of the psyche gathers the world such that the deeper logos of the world begins to gather the psyche. And as that happens, right, this fitting relationship, this fitting knowledge is the way that the one atones all. So in other words, I can start to hear in the particulars of what I'm hearing, in the particulars of what's appearing, in the particular situation, right? It's greater or deeper meaning that's concealed or withdrawn from the surface of appearance, in some sense, starts to you could say glow with the implicit deeper structure of the unity of the world, right? In some sense, it's like the difference between, hearing a bunch of noise and of the individual notes of a song and hearing music, where in some sense the individual notes that appear, what I actually hear, the harmony that I hear, is the unity of the song itself, but it's not in the particular notes, right? It's disclosed through the notes, right? So I think what Heraclitus is pointing to with the logos is that the unity of the world, not the totality, right? Not just the addition of all the parts creating the totality, but the wholeness of the world is a function of how we participate authentically, right? Or kind of a radical listening, a radical openness to what is not immediately apparent, right? But one can learn to read, one can learn to listen, one can learn to open oneself in gathering the world in such a way that the gathering of the logos itself becomes a fitted knowledge such that I can hear the music of the world. I can, the wholeness which conceals in its withdrawals from appearance, in it allowing the particular become manifest of the whole, right? So in other words, that doesn't have to happen. It's not like the one is just, it just is one, and that's just waiting for us to, pay attention to it. No, I think it speaks to a participant, as John would say, a participatory knowing, a authentic way of being in the world and constituting it with one's whole being, as a way of realizing the fullness of the human being as a being in the world, right? But what's interesting about this is, if you really think about this, is that I think what Heidegger is getting at, what all of the philosophers who talk about nihilism are getting at, a lot of the sense of nihilism or the meaning crisis, and all the different ways that you can kind of say that we don't listen, we don't hear that we don't listen, right? And that the nihilism today, I believe this is what Heidegger is getting at, is the nihilism is a necessary consequence of the lack of listening to the logos, right? And because we hear Heraclitus instead of the logos, right, we don't notice that our whole lives, in some sense, only reveal beings, right, and not being. And in that being the case, another way of saying that is that the world only discloses as a contingency, right? We see things in the current moment, in the current person, in the current relationship, in the current school, in the current thing I have to do as a means, right? contingent on something else, but the something else ends up becoming the next contingency, right? So a few generations of this, and people kind of grow up not even noticing that they live in such a way that they don't experience a moment in which being reveals itself as in its non-contingency, and it discloses itself in the truth of its unconcealment, in the thatness, right? In the that there is. God, this sense of wonderment is less and less able to be perceived, right? In such a deep way. I think this is what they're getting at with nihilism, right? The notion of nihilism. So taking that into mind and being mindful of that, right? How does one begin to respond to nihilism, right? Well, I think the first thing is that we probably need to start hearing that we're not listening, which is not easy. Right? Listening is really interesting because it's like to listen. I've noticed this in teaching people for years now, the art of circling, right? Listening. It's funny. It's really difficult to it's almost like to tell you how to listen is trying to tell someone how to think, right? For example, if I were to ask you, how do you think a thought? You'll go, well, I just think it. Well, no, but how do you think it? There's a way in which the how we think, we just think. We don't know how we think. We just think. We live out how to think. Our being knows how to think, right? It's very much the case with listening, right? So you can't really teach somebody to listen. I think what ends up actually happening is that people make listening explicit, and then they go to listen, and then they start to hear that they don't listen. And the moment that one hears that they're not listening is the moment that listening has begun, perhaps for the first time, right? It's so near. And it's so near that in its nearness, it's the most remote and furthest away. That's where nihilism is, right? I think is in that structure of nearness and the structure of thinking and how we think and how we listen. And therefore, the risk is always the very act of trying to, the very act of trying to solve nihilism, right, is often with the very consciousness that causes it, if you will. Right? So it's very tricky in this sense. So logos, right? I think the very beginning of philosophy really was with the pre-Socratics, and I would say logos seems to be, I would say Heraclitus's thinking of logos is the inception of the thinking of being, right? And it originally thought in its unity, right? And because of, thousands of years of, you could say, the separation of thought and being becomes more and more separate. It's analogous to saying that our connectedness with the world, right, is mirrored by our disconnection with thinking. And I mean in thinking, not like just, repetitive thoughts in your head. I don't mean that kind of thinking. I mean more like the deeper sense of comportment to the world has become more and more separate. We no longer, very rare, like I just don't think that people walk around with a sense in which I'm participating the world into appearance, right? Like that my world is banking on the way that I comport it, right? That it's a deep unified participation in it, right? I think there's a deep separation there, that that it was very difficult for people to even notice anymore. I think that's the crisis, right? So in addressing that, right, one of the things is, I think, a return to Heraclitus in the original sense of listening to the logos, right? It starts to bank on being able, right, to, I was me just kind of thinking this through, is being able to have some sense of the original notion of truth, right? The truth of being, right? Which is really is no longer the case, right? We now see truth as correctness, whereas the Greeks originally saw the primordial sense of truth was the event of unconcealment, or as Ivo de Janeiro says, disabscondedness. It's quite a funky word, but there's a sense in which the truth is the event of the unconcealedness into appearance of being, of the world. And that the deeper things, right, and what's interesting with this is that the deeper truths, right, cannot come into, they can't be disclosed into appearance, just like what we were talking about with the logos and in the Heraclitus fragment, in that we have to listen to the appearance. We have to actually hear and then listen to what we're hearing, such that what can be unconcealed, aletheia, can be revealed through, it can be flagrant in its disabscondedness. In other words, it can remain unconcealed, like the sense of wholeness, right? But it glows through the part. And that its truthness belongs to concealment. So in other words, now though, when we think about truth, we only really kind of see truth in terms of correctness, or, you know, this kind of separation between the world and the mind, right? Where the model of the world, when it matches the events in the world, that sense of correlation, we call that truth. And that if it doesn't, and it doesn't correlate, then it's not true. Whereas in the original notion of in early Greek, ancient Greek, something, when something was less true, right, they saw it as pseudo, right? Its appearance displayed less of concealment, right? In other words, they still saw nothing. Nothing still had being. In fact, all the good stuff was in the nothing. It was not nothing. It was the potential, the possibility out of which the world poured. And that truth was a way of comporting oneself into, in some sense, dancing with it out into more truthness and unconcealing its concealedness. So in other words, like poets really do understand, in that poetry, good poetry can reveal the unknown without making it known. They can reveal the unknown as such, but reveal it and preserve it in its unknownness, that sense of presence, right? Where it's not forced into appearance, which is really like optimization. This is this sense of utility, right? Seeing everything as a means to an end, or optimizing it, or extracting the energy out of it, right? Seeing everything as a resource. In order to do that, you have to really just relate to things in a very shallow way. you can't tend to the sense in which the deepest truth of being is in its inability to reveal itself in just its objective appearance. That the listening is the thing that can listen to what's most silent. That's what it is. It's that hum of silence. Thanks for listening.